Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan. I'm a solutions architect with StratusGrid. In this video, I wanted to introduce a relatively new preview feature that's available in the Amazon Bedrock service. Now, if you've never used Amazon Bedrock before, it's basically a managed service around large language models, similar to ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or Perplexity and other types of managed services out there that allow you to interact with large language models. Amazon Bedrock is basically just the AWS version of those types of managed services, and Bedrock provides AWS native integrations with other AWS services like Amazon S3 for retrieval augmented generation, or with Lambda functions that you can call for agent-based building. Now, there's a relatively new feature that we're going to talk about called Amazon Bedrock Prompt Flows, as well as the managed prompt feature that allows you to actually create visual node-based prompts inside of the AWS Management Console. And for this particular video, we're just going to go over a pretty brief example of how this works. And in future videos, we'll dive deeper into the topic and take a look at some more advanced use cases for this feature. But I did just want to point out that this is a relatively new feature. If you check out the What's New page on AWS, it shows you that on July 10th, the prompt management and prompt flows features are now available in preview. Keep in mind that these are only available in certain regions. So if you check out the list of regions that are supported down here, only certain regions are available, but they do have a pretty good set of global regions. I'm in the United States, so I'll probably either use the North Virginia or the Oregon US West 2 regions. But there are available regions around the world as well, in Europe and Asia and so on. Now, what these features are useful for is basically building out prompt workflows that kind of start with some input data and then navigate through a series of automation prompts that you set up yourself. And then finally, at the very end of that prompt flow, you get some kind of output. In fact, you can have multiple different output nodes, which you can oftentimes use for debugging purposes if you need to see the output from different stages of the prompt flow. But what you can do is connect these different nodes together using a visual builder that's embedded inside of the AWS Management Console, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. I'd encourage you, if you want to play around with this feature, to check out the Bedrock documentation. They do have some fairly decent documentation for starters, at least for a preview, under the prompt management section here, under the Bedrock user guide. And then there's also a separate section called prompt flows for Amazon Bedrock. And then under the how it works right here, they actually have a list of different node types that are available. So as you're working inside of the console and actually building out the node-based view, you can actually see a list of different types of nodes and specifically how to use those different types of nodes inside of your prompt flow. Now, the prompt node here is going to be one of the most common ones that you work with because the prompt node essentially sends off a large language model input prompt that you can send off to a model and then get a response and then feed that output into some other task. And that other task could be another LLM prompt. It could be an output node that just spits the output out into the editor. And it could also be something like a Lambda function, or you could feed it into retrieval augmented generation, which uses the knowledge bases feature. And we have a couple of separate videos on our channel that talk about knowledge bases with the Amazon Bedrock service. So definitely check those out if you're interested in that particular feature. And we might actually look at that in a future video combined with the prompt builder feature. But for now, I want to keep things pretty simple and just focus on a really basic workflow for the prompt builder feature. So what you want to do for starters is log in to your AWS account. Keep in mind that when you're working with the Bedrock service, there are invocation costs for the service. So you want to keep in mind that you should do some estimation on what your pricing is going to be using the pricing details on the marketing page for Bedrock. You can just Google Amazon Bedrock marketing page and you should come across the pricing details somewhere on there. Just make sure that you are not spending too much on the service and that you're not generating too much output from your LLMs. Otherwise, that will run up your bill pretty quickly. But for the minimal usage that we're going to be looking at here, it shouldn't take too much cost. So what we're going to do is navigate to the Bedrock console for starters here. And you'll see a lot of common features here, like our foundation models. And if you haven't signed up for Bedrock yet and you haven't used it before, there's actually this model access that you'll need to open up here, and you'll need to make sure that you opt in to a bunch of different models here, depending on which models you actually want to use. In general, I tend to use the Anthropic models here, like Claude 3 Opus or Sonnet, generally speaking. There's also a newer version of Claude 3.5 Sonnet as well that I haven't yet opted into here. So I'd like to try that out at some point, but usually the Claude 3 Sonnet model is a pretty kind of middle of the road model that you can use for your LLMs. In particular, you're going to notice that we have under Builder Tools here, there's a prompt management feature. And what we can do is predefine prompts that we can reuse inside of our prompt flows. So you can just define a prompt and you can specify input variables in that prompt. And then you can simply reference that prompt with its corresponding inputs variables inside of a prompt flow. If we head over to prompt flows here, this is how we can actually define a flow by using the visual node-based builder. So for starters, what we're going to do is hit this button here called Create Prompt Flow. And when we hit Create Prompt Flow, we're just going to give it a name. And I'm just going to call this Random Name Generator. And we'll just give it a description like generates some random names depending on the specified country. And then down here, we're just going to say to create a new service role in the AWS IAM service. It'll automatically update that role with the necessary permissions if you try to access any third-party features outside of the prompt builder. So that is kind of nice, but there is some additional setup work that you have to do if you're going to invoke a Lambda function. We're not going to talk about that in this particular video just for the sake of time, but that is something that you want to consider. You have to set up a service that can, the Bedrock service principal, being able to access that Lambda function as invoker of that function. So there is an extra step that you have to run through there, but that's actually something you have to do with some other services as well. So now that we've figured out the details for our prompt flow here, we're just going to hit create. This is going to open up the node-based editor. Now the screen can look a little bit busy here. So generally I like to minimize this left-hand sidebar there because when we're working in the prompt builder, we don't usually have to switch contexts to other features within the Bedrock console. And typically it's kind of annoying, but the notifications always pop up at the top right here and kind of disrupt the flow. So you always have to make sure that anytime that you save changes to your prompt flow, you'll have to go ahead and minimize or actually scroll up in your browser and then click to delete those notifications. It would be nice if those showed up somewhere else so they weren't kind of changing the layout of the page, but hopefully they'll fix that in a future version. Also, before you are testing, you can minimize the right-hand sidebar, although we are going to need to open this test screen back up so that we can actually enter some input in this box right down here. So we'll type something like Colombia, or maybe something like France, or America, or something like that, and that'll be the country that feeds into our input for our prompt flow. Now, when you create a new prompt flow, you're going to have a couple of different nodes for starters here. So on the left-hand side where your flow begins, you're going to have flow input, and then on the right-hand side, you're going to have flow output. So let's get rid of that right-hand sidebar there so we can see things a little bit more clearly here. So we've got flow input and flow output. So flow input is going to have a document that is whatever you feed in to the tester, which is right over here. So anything that you type into test prompt flow is going to get fed as the flow input. Now, when you run that flow input, that data has to go somewhere. So what we do is we take these little nodes here and we connect the input or the output to the input of another node. So we could basically just take the input and feed it directly to an output, but that's not really doing anything useful. We want to do some kind of data processing on the input that we pass into the prompt flow so that we can get some kind of different processed output, right? Otherwise, we're not really getting any value from the service. We're just getting out what we feed into it, and that just doesn't really add any value. So to add some value to this prompt flow here, we're going to open up this left-hand sidebar and we're going to go to nodes. And this is where you have several different types of nodes available. And the most common one that I generally find is going to be useful here is the prompt node. So what the prompt node does, if we head back over to the documentation here and take a look at node types, The prompt node is going to define a prompt to use in the flow. You can use a prompt from prompt management, or you can define an inline prompt right inside of the node itself. So you don't have to use the prompt management section of the console if you don't want to. But if you have a prompt that's going to be commonly reused across multiple different prompt flows, or even multiple times within the same flow, then you'll want to make sure that you use prompt management in order to define that prompt separately so that you can update it once in a central location and have that automatically have that change take effect on multiple other prompts. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and plug in the prompt that we want to use here. So what I'm going to do is go to my prompt node and go to configure. And what we're going to do for now is just say, I want to define the prompt directly inside of the node. I don't want to use a prompt from prompt management because I'd have to go over to the prompt management feature, specify that separately, and then come back here and say, use a prompt that's already been defined in prompt management. So for now, I'm just going to do the kind of hard-coded method here where we just force a prompt inside of the node. I'm going to choose the Claude 3 Sonnet type here, that model. And then what we're going to do is give this a name, like generate first names and call it JSON. And I'll show you why I'm calling it JSON in just a second here. So we've already chosen the model that we're going to use for this particular prompt. And now, right now, you can see that this node does not have any inputs defined. What we have to do in order to define inputs so that we can connect our input document, our flow input, to the prompt is we need to define some variables. And so to define those variables, what we're going to say is generate some random first names with the X country here. So we're going to use these double curly braces on the left and double curly braces on the right. And as soon as we do that, you can see that that appears as an input variable. Now we can have multiple input variables here as well. So I could say generate some random, X names, and then I could say either first or last names as a dynamic input, or I could say middle names if I wanted to as an input right there. But for now, I'm just going to hard code generate some random first names from the country, and then that's going to be a placeholder for whatever country that we feed into the prompt builder. And then what I'm going to do is say return these names as a JSON array. So what I want the LLM to do, in this case, Claude 3 Sonnet right here, I want that model to generate some random first names from whatever country I specify when I actually execute this prompt flow. And then I want it to take those names and then format it as a JSON array so I can feed it into another step inside of my prompt flow. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy this prompt right here, and we're going to create another one for last names, because what I want to do is try to get a first name and a random last name from the same country. So that's why I'm variabilizing it. But then I want to take those first and last names. I want to choose a random one from a list, and then I want to spit that out as output from my prompt flow. All right, so what we're going to do is just copy that, and then we're going to add in another prompt here. We're going to add in another node. We're going to call this generate last names JSON. We're going to say define inside of the node right here, and we're going to paste this in, but we're going to change first names to last names. And then we're going to say select model. I'm just going to choose the same Claude 3 Sonnet model right here. And so now we have two different prompt nodes here. We've got one prompt that generates some first names as a JSON array, and we have a prompt that generates some last names as a JSON array. So now we can just take the flow input here. We're going to feed that into the country variable for first names. We're going to feed that same value as the input for the country variable for last names here. And then we have our output node here. So what I'm going to do is actually create a couple of debug output nodes so that I can see what both of these generate. But then I'm going to have a third prompt node that's going to take a random item from the first list and a random item from the second list and mash them together into a single string value. So that'll be my third output. So for starters here, I'm just going to call this output first name. And then I'm going to add a couple more outputs here. So we'll say flow output over here. We'll say flow output right here. And I'm going to add another prompt node here. Let's get rid of that for now. And down here, I'm going to call this flow or output last names. And then over here, I'm going to call this output full name. And then for this prompt right here, we're going to take this prompt and feed it into this output right here, because this prompt is going to generate the full name. This prompt is going to just generate the last names. So I want to see just the last names by itself to make sure I can validate the output from this node before it gets fed into this node, to make sure that this node is receiving the expected output from the last names node. And then same thing up here. I'm going to send the debug output to output first name. But then for this prompt right here, this is going to be called generate full name. And again, we're going to say define in node, because we're not using the prompt management feature to define our prompts separately. So I'll go to Anthropic. We'll choose the Sonnet model here once again. And for the prompt, I'm going to say take a random first name from, and then I'm going to variabilize this and say first names. And so I'm going to put these double curly braces around it. That's going to create an input variable here and add it before a random item from variable last names. And so then we'll say, and return this as a JSON string. Actually, I'll say a flat JSON string. I don't think it's going to necessarily do exactly what I want, but I do want to specify that I just get a flat JSON string just with double quotes around it. It might end up wrapping it in an array. It might end up wrapping it in a JSON object, but we should get something pretty close to what we're expecting. So what we'll do is take the output from the first names node and feed that into first names. And then we're going to take the last names as JSON and feed that into last names. And I think we have everything set up right here. So we've got this prompt flow. We're going to feed in a country. So I could say Colombia, I could say France, I could say whatever I want to. And then I could just generate some first names from that country, generate some last names from that country. And then we're going to combine those together into a final output. So let's go ahead and click on save right up here. And if nothing goes wrong, then we should get a green message saying that it was successful right up here. So that looks good. And so now what we can do is open up the sidebar here to test this out. And what I'm going to do is just specify a country as my input here. So let's specify Colombia for starters. And we're going to get 3 different outputs because we have 3 different gold nodes here with the output first name, last name. Those are our debug outputs just to validate. And then we have output full name. And so now we can see here's a JSON array of random first names from Colombia. So we got a nice huge list here. It looks like maybe about 15 to 20. For last names, we got an array of 15 to 20 last names. And so now it says, here's a random first name from the provided array of Colombian first names, Salome Quintero. Okay, so Quintero was the 4th to last node in that. And the first name, Salome, was the 7th, I think, to last, 8th to last node in the first names list. So it did indeed select a random node from each of these lists. Now, if you'd like to restrict it a little bit more, you could go into each of these first name and last name prompts and kind of tweak them a little bit and say generate 10 random first names. And then for last names, we'll say generate 10 random last names. That'll just kind of limit the output a little bit more so that when you're debugging things, you don't have to look through quite as much output. So we see the green bar here again, indicating that it was successfully updated. We can go here and test it out. So let's say French and see what we get back. So we should get 3 outputs here with first names, last names, and the final full name. And so here we go. So first name actually has some extra text here, and we want to avoid that. And we can also see that we've got these JSON backticks right here. We generally want to kind of avoid that, but it looks like the full name prompt right here did actually correctly interpret those. So even though it has that extra backticks and the extra text from around it, it looks like it still was able to extract just the JSON and then interpret that. So our first name is Mercier. So let's see if that's in the list right here. So it doesn't look like that's in the list. So that's kind of a bug inside of our workflow right here. And then the last name is Theo. And I don't see that in the last names here. So what we want to do is go back to these prompts here so that we don't get this extra text here or any of these backticks or anything like that. So what I like to do in these prompts here is say, hey, I don't want any extra text. So do not include any extra text. Do not include any backticks. And then we'll go ahead and just copy that and we'll put it into the last names as well. We'll go ahead and save that. And let's test it out once again. I did have kind of a working version of this that respected the inputs and outputs. So let's see if we can get it to work here. So let's go ahead and plug in French here again and see what we get back. Hopefully it'll actually select an item from the two lists this time. So we get a bunch of first names, a bunch of last names, and you can see this time they don't have any extra output around them. There's no backticks, there's no additional kind of lead text in front of it. And so now it's saying, here's a Python script that generates this, right? So in this case, we don't want that either. So I'm going to come to the generate full name node right here, and we're going to add some tweaks to this node. So what we'll do in generate full name is say, do not generate any code, and say, do not include any backticks. And hopefully that'll prevent it from generating any code that would be used to generate a full name. So let's go ahead and save that, and then we'll test it once again. And I'll say Colombian this time, just to see what we get back. And we should get back our 3 outputs right here. So here's a list of first names. There's no extra text. Last names, no extra text. That looks good. And so now as the final output, we get Sebastian. So Sebastian does appear in this first list, and then we get Jimenez or Jimenez. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but that is the third to the last item in this list. So it took the last item from here. It took the third to last item from here. So there is some randomness happening right there. And then it returned a JSON object with a single name property. And then the value that we are feeding in is the actual full name that we want there. So what we could do is change this and say, let's do an American name and see if it works similarly well. So we have our standard JSON array and our standard JSON array for last names. And this time we get Michael Roach. So let's see, Michael is in the list here and Roach is in the list right here. So our generate full name prompt is definitely honoring the 2 JSON input lists that we are providing as inputs to it. So what you can see is that we're able to build this dynamic flow here by using a natural language approach. So we're kind of doing some coding without actually doing any coding, and we're able to kind of generate some dynamic data. We're able to take 2 different sets of dynamic data and kind of join them together and then generate some additional new result based on those 2 dynamic inputs that we're receiving from earlier inside of the prompt flow. So I'd encourage you to play around with this. It's pretty easy to do. All you have to do is go into these prompt nodes and specify your input variables with these curly braces. So that's how you define what input values you're going to have for each of these nodes. And then there's also a bunch of other node types that you can play around with. And again, for this particular video, we're not going to get into things like agents or Lambda functions or RAG with the knowledge base feature right here. You can also store and retrieve data from S3, which we're not going to talk about here as well. There's also a chatbot integration with the Amazon Lex chatbot service out there as well. So there's a bunch of different features here that you can play around with. But as you can see here, just purely using the prompt node type without even having to integrate with any Lambda functions or any kind of RAG feature, we were able to build a fully dynamic workflow here using the Claude 3 model from Anthropic, which is hosted on the Bedrock service itself. So I really like this feature. I think it's pretty cool that they are making things easier to build here. So rather than having to kind of code up custom Lambda functions for agents or having to set up knowledge bases, I like the fact that you can actually build a fully dynamic prompt flow here just using a visual node-based editor right inside of your browser. So feel free to go play around with this feature. Let us know what you think about it in the comments down below. If you learned something new from this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you get notified about future videos from StratusGrid. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.